you for being with us tonight. We are gathered to listen to a conversation about philanthropy's role in society and why effective giving matters. I'm so pleased to see students, faculty, staff, and alumni in the audience. And I'd like to thank Strata Education for sponsoring this event. And for our technology work, you would see a PowerPoint slide with their logo on it and Phil's face and David's face as well. We'll have to do with that. This looks a little bit more intimate and kind of New York. We are pleased to have a national leader and author with us tonight, and you'll have an opportunity to have him sign his new book, which is available for purchase, and I hear they're selling quickly outside. My duty tonight is to introduce Professor Catherine Harold, who will serve as our host this evening. She will introduce Phil Buchanan and start our conversation. But before I do, allow me to remind you of two upcoming events. On March 7th, we will have a late lecture with David Brooks and Ann Snyder, starting at 6 p.m. in St. Luke's. Another event you won't want to miss is Mays Family Institute will host Anne-Marie Argalagos, the president of Hispanics in Philanthropy, and that will be April 7th at 5:30 in the Indianapolis Central Library. And now, a little bit about Professor Harold. Catherine Harold is an assistant professor at the Indiana University Lilly Family School of Philanthropy and a faculty affiliate at the O'Neill School of Public and Environmental Affairs. Her research examines how non-governmental organizations, philanthropic foundations, and grassroots groups work to promote change in the Middle East. She has conducted fieldwork in Egypt, Palestine, Jordan, Syria, and Qatar. Her book, Delta Democracy, Pathways to Incremental Civic Revolution in Egypt and Beyond, uncovers the strategies that Egyptian NGOs have used to advance the aims of the country's 2011 Arab Spring uprisings. The book is forthcoming next month from Oxford University Press. Dr. Harold's work has also appeared in prominent academic journals, and her career, as you will hear, has crossed paths with our distinguished guests. She holds a PhD in public policy from Duke University, a master's from the London School of Economics, and a BA from Holyoke. Please welcome Dr. Harold.
Welcome and thank you all for coming. Phil suggested that I simply say, "This is Phil, and we're going to talk about philanthropy." That might give you some insight into Phil's characteristic humility. But actually, Phil has had a profound impact on the field of philanthropy, particularly in the past 2 decades. Back in 2001, Phil was tapped to be the first chief executive of the Center for Effective Philanthropy, an organization that he continues to lead today. Now, the Center for Effective Philanthropy, or the CEP, is a very rare organization in today's world of philanthropy. Early on, the center created the Grantee Perception Report, or GPR, which essentially brings the voices of grantees into the rarefied offices of the world's most influential philanthropic foundations. It allows program officers who hardly ever hear candid feedback about how they're doing to hear directly, if anonymously, from their grantees. Phil is very committed to bringing the voices of those affected by policies into debates that affect shape the policies that affect them. And toward that end, he co-founded an organization called Youth Truth, which brings the voices of K through 12 students into policy debates about education policy. Phil publishes extensively in the Chronicle of Philanthropy. He pens op-eds in media outlets such as the Financial Times, the Boston Globe. You see him on the sort of philanthropy media circuit He hasn't been on Hassan Minhaj yet, but we're hoping that he makes it there. And also writes for CEP's blog. As Dean Pasek mentioned, in 2019, he published this book, Giving Done Right, that draws upon Phil's 2 decades of working with foundation leaders to offer lessons learned, to suggest that the answers of the business world are not necessarily the answers in the world of philanthropy. Well, we'll discuss more about the book tonight. Phil is also a brave human being. At the age of 25, he served as the assistant to the president of Mount Holyoke College, which is the oldest women's college in the United States. And he was, I speak from experience, quite a presence on campus. Now, in addition to all of these accomplishments, Phil did make one major mistake in his career. That was in late 2001, early 2002. He passed yours truly over for a job at the newly formed Center for Effective Philanthropy. But all is well that ends well. I did sign on as a summer fellow in the summer of 2004 and continue to consider the center a real partner in my own work on my research on foundations and grant making. So that's the full disclosure. Phil and I have worked together, and as I said, all's well that ends well. Phil, it's an honor to reconnect with you, to have you here tonight, and cue the Guns N' Roses, Phil Buchanan.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for coming.
So Phil and I will have a public conversation for about 30, 40 minutes or so, and then we'll be opening it up to a conversation with all of you. Now, Phil, back when I was a fellow at the center, we were still very much in startup mode, and much of our work was asking questions and having conversations about the role of philanthropy in the world and our role in that. And we always ask very provocative questions of each other. And I'm going to begin tonight with what I think is a provocative question. You are at a school of philanthropy, the world's first school of philanthropy, where our motto is improving philanthropy to improve the world. Now, in the past few years, we've heard a chorus of critics who have suggested that philanthropy isn't so much improving the world as it is part and parcel of many of the problems that our world is currently facing. Could you please give the audience an overview of how you understand this argument to be playing out? What are the critics saying, and what are your perspectives on it? What did they get right? What did they get wrong? And what is your outlook on the role of philanthropy in our world today?
Great, thanks, Katie. And obviously, it was the biggest mistake that we made in our institutional history, not to hire you, but we did remedy it by bringing you on for that fellowship. And it's great to be here and with all the great people at the Lilly School. I think it is so important that this institution exists, and the last time I visited here, there were way fewer faculty and staff at the Lilly School. The building was not nearly so nice, and it's amazing to see, and so important because philanthropy, and this gets to your question, I think is a crucial force for good in our society. Is it always perfect? And of course not. Are there lots of specific instances of foolish philanthropy that we should critique? Absolutely, and we should do that. Should we debate the right role of philanthropy, the role of government, the role of business? Yes, and I think those debates should happen at institutions like this, as opposed to just being driven by business schools, as I fear they too often are, and we'll come back to that later maybe. But the critiques, I think none of them are really new, but they are definitely higher profile today than they were a few years ago. And so just to take a couple of them, there's Anand Giridharadas, who is essentially the ubiquitous commentator if you turn on MSNBC now, who had a book called Winners Take All, the Elite Charade of Changing the World, in which he, I think, does a fabulous job of really blowing up the myth, the absurd myth, that it is companies that will solve all our most pressing social problems while simultaneously making everyone rich. And I got nothing against free market capitalism. I'm a big believer in capitalism, but business has limits, and there's a lot of problems we have in our society that cannot be fixed by market solutions. And I think Anand does a good job of sort of dismantling the happy talk of recent years that has led some people to confuse joining McKinsey with joining the Peace Corps, which are not the same thing. Where I think Anand loses me is when he then goes on to, somewhat in the book, but more in his subsequent writing, to write off essentially all philanthropy, or at least all big philanthropy, as some kind of ruse of self-protection or reputation laundering to distract you with one hand, as he always says, over here with what's really going on over there. And again, we can look at specific examples, and maybe some of us would agree that Jeff Bezos should spend more time focusing on what could make Amazon have less of a negative environmental impact, and less time making an announcement that had absolutely no details behind it about a pledge, a very impressive pledge, but you would think it would have been a little bit more thought through before the press release was put out. So there's absolutely truth there, and having worked for 18 years with many of the biggest foundations in the world, sometimes with the donors connected to those big foundations, I do not believe that all philanthropy is in fact some cynical ruse, and I think that the frustration that I think, in my opinion, many rightfully share about the way we approach taxation in this country. I would like to see, for example, as I was just discussing with Patrick Rooney, capital gains tax the same as any other income. I would like to see a higher marginal tax rate for the wealthiest, but I don't think that should lead us to then say, okay, well, or sort of give up on the notion that for better or for worse, here we are on planet Earth in the society that we have, with the elected representatives that we have for now. People have a lot of wealth. I would like them to put it to good use and to do it effectively, and I've seen the good that can do. And I think the good that can do, and this goes to the second critique that I want to mention, in actually strengthening our democracy. So another prominent critic, again, he's been making the variations of the same example for the same argument for a long time, but has recently had a lot of attention focused on his book. Is a guy named Rob Reich, who I understand was here recently, wrote a book called Just Giving. Argues that philanthropy is, at its essence, an anti-democratic exercise of power. I don't know how to square that with the philanthropy that's supported Amendment 4 in Florida and the effort to re-enfranchise more than 1 million formerly incarcerated people, which seems to me like something that is absolutely strengthening democracy. I don't know how to square that with the work on criminal justice reform that Brian Stevenson and others have led, supported by philanthropy, the work that the Public Welfare Foundation did to cut in half the rate of juvenile incarceration in this country through policy change at the state level in 12 years. It's still way too high. But these things to me are healthy expressions of philanthropic goals in a vibrant democratic society that I think needs 3 sectors, not just the 2 that Anand and Rob feel like they're very much focused on, which are government and business. So that's probably not fully doing justice to either of their arguments. But I'd say it's also not doing justice fully to all the issues I have with either of their arguments. So I'll leave it at that. And there are other critics out there too that we could talk about.
Phil, we will come back to the question of the business sector's influence in the field of philanthropy. But first, I want to follow up on the question of the recent, or should I say, recently reinvigorated critiques of philanthropy, and ask what it's like, or what conversations these critiques are prompting inside of foundations. You and your team have a very, very unique insider's view of foundations. You, every week, are meeting with the leaders and program officers of foundations around the country, around the world. As my students and I often remark, foundations tend to be black boxes. We, as the general public, don't really know what conversations are taking place inside the foundations. You and your team have a window into that. Have the critiques that have been permeating the Twitter sphere, mainstream media, etc., have they, what's going on inside the foundations? How are foundations reacting?
Yeah, I want to try to not just speak anecdotally and say that in a study that we're doing where we have interviewed about 40 foundation CEOs, and then there's a much larger survey on their thinking about influence on policy. We asked some questions about, like, look, are you worried that you're having an outsized and anti-democratic influence on policy? And we can talk about, like, who the sample is and whether there's response bias and who signs up for a study on policy being conducted by CEP and so on, and all of that's probably reasonable. But in general, what folks say there is like, look, this is not really a critique that resonates with us because we are literally trying to elevate the perspective of those with the least power in our policy influence efforts for those foundations that are indeed trying to influence policy. So while we could say there are examples, look at Mark Zuckerberg's effort in Newark, where there is no doubt that the philanthropy was way too top-down, not informed by families, by students, by people in neighborhoods and communities who Zuckerberg was saying he was working for. And I believe he thought he was, right, to improve education there. And yet those voices were left out of the discussion. And this happens way too often, right? Where it's like we think we know best what other people need. That mistake happens way too often in philanthropy, and at the same time, very few of the people I talk to are like aspiring to make that mistake, right? They're trying not to. And when we surveyed foundation CEOs in 2016, and we asked them about 24 different practices, like trendy, hot practices and more regular, mundane practices, which ones do you think would lead to the greatest increase in foundation impact? So we asked them about things like impact investing and scaling evidence-based programs, and the #1 response was listening to and learning from the intended beneficiaries of our philanthropy. So foundation CEOs themselves agree that they need to be more connected to communities and people in fields that they're trying to address. #2 was listening to and learning from grantees. That doesn't mean they're all doing a great job of it, right? But there's way less disagreement between the critics and the practitioners than some of the critics would have you think. So, most of the foundations that we work with, and again, they're the ones that are really committed to, the stuff that we believe in terms of the importance of really working to be as effective as possible. They are focused on their goals, and the goals have to do with all kinds of issues, like improving child welfare and outcomes for former foster kids, or doing something about climate change, and doing it in a way that deals with the disproportionate effects of climate change on vulnerable communities and communities of color. Like, these are the conversations that I'm having. They're not conversations with the sort of monstrous, caricatured, foundation executive cartoons that I think Anand in particular is painting.
Phil, I would like to come back to this question of raising the voices of marginalized populations, et cetera. But first, in this era in which philanthropy is suddenly all over the news, what is the role of a school of philanthropy where faculty are conducting rigorous research on foundations and grant making, where students are inspiring the questions that faculty ask because of their work in the field? What's the role of a school?
Yeah, I sort of alluded to this at the beginning. I think you have such an important role because you are exclusively focused on philanthropy and the nonprofits that philanthropy supports. So I'll just contrast that with the sort of what I see on the business school campuses. So I was just at the business school that I went to as a guest speaker at a class, and the tone of the conversation was, until I had a chance to speak, was very negative about the efficacy of nonprofit organizations. And the assumption was, at least by the panelists, not so much the students, there was more diversity of view, but the assumption was all is needed is a little kick in the pants from the business savvy investor types, because the nonprofit folks are asleep at the switch and they just settled in for a long nap, and here we are to save the day. It wasn't that much different, and I write about in this book, than what I heard 20 years ago when I was a student there. And I find it so frustrating and maddening because, and how many of you here have worked at operating nonprofits? And how many of you have worked on the giving side, the foundation? Okay. And I just think, and there'll be time, I think, for you to disagree with me if you want to, but I think running a nonprofit, let's say in a community let's say a community health organization, or running a nonprofit that is trying to get the most gang-involved young people out of gang life, or running a nonprofit that is working on creating educational opportunities in the summer for students who, because of their family income, wouldn't have access to those opportunities. It takes everything it takes to run an equivalent-sized business, and a whole bunch more. It's a harder job. And I think that if you study the sector, right, you can hopefully help educate people about the unique challenges of the sector, the unique contributions and role of the sector, and prepare folks with the tools and resources that they need that are particular to the challenges of the sector, but that are not just foisted frameworks from Harvard Business Review that make sense, for Cisco, but don't have a heck of a lot of relevance for nonprofits. And I'm not saying that there isn't learning to be done across sectors. There is. But I'm saying, first of all, that it goes both ways. And second of all, that oftentimes what nonprofits need in terms of tools and approaches in areas like strategy or performance measurement are not the same tools and approaches that business school students are taught. So I'm really glad that this institution exists, that it has the talented faculty and students that it does. And I wouldn't say that, if I didn't believe it, even though I'm here. Trust me. You don't know me well enough to know that, but it's true.
I know you well enough, I think, to know that, and it's true. Phil, let's talk about your book.
Okay.
Why write the book?
Question I asked myself at various points in the process. I think it's a mix of, as you can probably tell, I am inspired by the role that nonprofits supported by effective philanthropy can play. I often do this thing. I'm not big on icebreakers, but if I'm meeting a group of people and we're introducing, I'll ask, could you just tell me about one, like who you are, and also just one nonprofit that's played a role in your life? Typically, even if it's a small group, people end up crying, because the stories are so powerful, and if people stop and think about it, there are nonprofits that have played a profound role, and it's a different role than a role the government or business might play in your life. Those can be important too. They're probably less likely to bring you to tears. Well, they might bring, it depends. The R&B has brought me to tears, I'll admit, but anyway. So I think we take for granted, that we don't worry about our niece or nephew, dying of yellow fever because Rockefeller Foundation supported the vaccine that means we don't have to worry about it anymore. I think, I for one, I'm glad that I no longer have to worry about whether people I love in my family can marry the people they love in their families because of all of the work that philanthropy supported that led to marriage equality. And we can all pick our favorites and we'll all have different ones, and that's part of what it's about too. So I wanted to try to write a book that communicated a positive case about philanthropy and nonprofits. At the same time, I think the book probably has more specific negative critiques of philanthropy, where I'm naming names of folks who I think have done it wrong than any of the so-called critical books, right? Because I also think that philanthropy has to be effective, and that we need to learn from what's gone wrong as well as what's gone right. And I got frustrated over 18 years in this job by seeing so many people make the same predictable mistakes again and again. And the mistakes really, I think, do, at their very essence, stem from a lack of humility about the degree to which this challenge is distinct and different. That disrupting, poverty is not going to be like Uber disrupting the taxi industry. That these are really complicated problems. They are, by definition, often the hardest problems, the ones that have defied market or government solutions. So I don't want to sound like the least bit like vain or. It wasn't so much that I thought, I don't know that books influence anyone. I really don't. It wasn't so, but I knew that for my emotional health, if I thought that I had tried to influence some folks, not to make these same mistakes and to have the resources that they need that are particular to this challenge, then at least I would know that I tried.
Phil, for those of the audience members who haven't yet had a chance to read the book and who are going to be finding it outside this evening, could you give us a few key takeaways of what you lay out in the book in terms of thoughts on effectiveness, but then also a few key mistakes that you see as being consistently made in the sector? Sure.
Yeah, I mean, I think with respect to strategy in philanthropy, I think one of it relates to what I'm talking about the business analogies, but now let's make it specific with an example. Strategy, by which I mean like a logic about if I do these things, I think it will lead to this. That is guiding decision making. Has been defined, I think, in a way that has more resonance for business than it does for philanthropy, and that's been a huge problem. So there was a very influential article in Harvard Business Review in 1999 that argued that strategy in philanthropy is no different than it is in business, and it requires unique positioning. It said a bunch of other stuff, but that was one of its main messages. Well, this, to me, makes no sense. It makes sense in the corporate competitive world. When I was a strategy consultant in the corporate world, absolutely. We didn't want anyone to know what our clients' strategies were, and we wanted it to be unique and hard for anybody else to replicate. So in business, you want your strategy to be yours alone. However, if you're a foundation and your strategy is yours alone, you're in deep trouble. Strategies need to be shared because the dynamics are not competitive, they're collaborative, right? Why would I not do exactly what you're doing if what you're doing is making progress against the goal I care about, right? And why wouldn't I try to align with you to do it well? And why wouldn't I make sure that the nonprofits that we fund also agree that it makes sense? And on top of that, the people whose lives we're trying to improve. So related also on strategy is this kind of focus on the technical fix. This comes out of Silicon Valley a lot. I think the analog to the breakthrough technology. Now this one is a little more nuanced. It's not that it's never right. I think you could argue that the Gates Foundation's work in global health, which has been somewhat top-down and focused on a particular idea, which is that people are dying needlessly of diseases that vaccinations could prevent them from dying from, it's sort of an analog to a technological breakthrough. It is a technological breakthrough, actually, and that, well, it's way more complicated to actually figure out how to get people vaccinated than it may seem. That is like kind of the one answer, right? But that's relatively rare, that there is that one answer in philanthropy, and when you take that same approach and you apply it, as I think that foundation has, and laudably, they've tried to do something about education, and I think that's good. And they've tried to do it by looking for the analog to the vaccine or the technological breakthrough, and I think that's not good. And it happens too often. So the focus at Gates, as many of you know, was let's break big high schools into small high schools, and we'll have better outcomes because that's going to be the ticket, and it wasn't. And then let's focus on teacher evaluation, being more rigorous, connecting it to teacher pay, that's going to do it, and it didn't. Let's focus on common core. And again, not the magic bullet, because there is no magic bullet in a complicated, interdependent challenge like that, where not only do you have all of the challenges of the educational systems, you also have poverty that affects, and opportunities that affect what people can do in school. So, but too often this is what we hear, that there's going to be all the focus is on some new innovation, some single thing. And then the third thing, I think I'm answering both at once. It's like what not to do and what to do, is with respect to performance measurement, where there is, this desperate desire for the analog to return on investment, the universal metric against which we can gauge all of our philanthropy, just like you and I could compare our 401k returns or whatever. But it doesn't exist, right? So even if you could get beyond the fact that you can't actually draw the causal line between what you funded and what happened, right? You are, as a donor, just one of many funders of something important. But let's say you could, somehow you knew that you were solely responsible for something. You can't put in common units, right? The effort to reduce CO2 emissions in Indianapolis that somehow led to a 5% reduction that I can claim credit for against you claiming credit for an increase in graduation rates, in high school graduation rates in Indianapolis of 15%. We both spent the same amount of money. It's not productive to try to put that into impact units, right? It's productive to approach assessment relative to the goal that we had and relative to the context that we're in. So the right measures are going to vary dramatically at the nonprofit level and at the foundation level. And yet, all the time, people say, boy, what we really need, there was a book called Philanthrocapitalism, How the Rich Can Save the World. That literally was the subtitle until the paperback came out, and it was How Giving Can Change the World. That book came out in the fall of 2008, and it's right after Lehman Brothers collapsed. And but they must have submitted the manuscript several months before, and it said that what we need in philanthropy and nonprofits is the same kind of discipline that the financial markets have just before the collapse, right? And that what we need to see more of is MBAs entering, literally said this in the book, the broken stock world of nonprofits. And that's the kind of simplistic stereotyping. I mean, nothing I learned in my MBA program taught me how to assess, different approaches to childhood obesity. I learned how to calculate financial ratios, right? Also, what's wrong with Birkenstocks? But that's a whole other question. Yeah.
Bill, let's go back to this question of the importance of foundations getting into their communities, right?
Yeah.
You discussed this in the book. It came up earlier, and it's a big question here in the U.S. and globally, where philanthropy and in particular government foreign aid, but for private philanthropy as well, has been critiqued as being more of a top-down model, removed from local communities. What I'm wondering, I have some interrelated questions, and please feel free to speak to any of them. But what are some success stories? I mean, that's hard for foundations to do, right? As I mentioned earlier, foundation offices tend to be rarefied places. How can program officers and foundation leaders get into communities in ways that are meaningful and in ways that are legitimate? You talk often, not necessarily in the book, but on your talk circuit about the importance of board diversity. We know that traditionally foundation boards have been largely male and white. How does that affect foundations' legitimacy when going into communities? The question of performance assessment. Foundations, foreign aid has been slammed for imposing bureaucratic reporting requirements on grantees. How can foundations work with grantees as co-learners? And it just escaped me. Oh, no, yes, it did. There was one more. Anyway, I'll stop there.
I mean, that's a lot that you just said.
Everyone's glad I stopped there.
Yeah, it's really good. My therapist used to always say that actually she would just go, "That's a lot." But then
I can try to repeat more very concisely.
So I would just like, and? That's all you're going to say? But I'll try to say more than that. So, yeah, that's a lot.
How do foundations get into communities?
Well, so it's so complicated too, right? Because it's like, everything is contextual. And so, like, it is not necessarily the right move for the foundation to kind of walk around its nonprofit grantees and establish its own. It depends, right? There's a lot here I think has to be done in partnership with nonprofits. So we want a shared strategy that works. Well, to know that it works, we need to hear from the people we think it would work for, right? And if we don't, things can go terribly astray. And so, I write in the book, for example, about the Stewart Foundation, $300 million foundation at the time in San Francisco, and their work on child welfare and improving life outcomes for foster kids, and the way in which they asked questions about whether there were different ways to approach helping foster kids either get adopted at an older age or develop lifelong connections with caring adults. And they did that by looking at examples of other communities, but also by talking directly with foster kids and saying, what is your experience? And also looking at the research and then sharing it to build a coalition of folks who agreed that there was a different way that it could be done. And then they tried it in a small way. They didn't go all in. And then it had traction, and they proceeded from there. So, it's iterative. It involves a lot of communication back and forth, and it's really hard. I recently did a session at South Houston Council on Foundations, and I was supposed to be the moderator of a session that was supposed to be about how foundations learn from failure. And for various reasons, we had never all been on the phone together, although we had exchanged emails prior to being on this panel. And so I said, why don't we start by having you each share what the failure was? And these three very different foundations proceeded to share basically the same failure, which was that they thought they knew better. They thought they knew what a community needed, but the community said, you didn't get it. It was really stunning. And so we kind of scrapped the session description and just said, like, why does this keep happening? And there's all kinds of reasons having to do with power dynamics between the funder and the funded and so on. it's very difficult to get around it. I do think it's possible, and but I think that nonprofits you're working with have to be a part of the answer. It's not like if a program officer, walks into the nonprofit human services organization and says, "Oh, hi, don't mind me, I'm here to talk to your client." That's not going to go great. So, but I think it's contextual and really, really challenging. On the issue of diversity on boards or lack thereof, my own view on this is that the lack of racial diversity at many, probably most large foundation boards, with some exceptions that are really positive that we can talk about, the lack of diversity on many different dimensions, but definitely racial diversity, is absolutely impeding folks' effectiveness, and it's hard to explain or understand. It's inexcusable. It's easy to understand, but it is really, really hard to accept. And then also, why aren't nonprofit leaders, more often in those board seats at foundations? And why, I have no issue with investment bankers and lawyers serving on boards. I do have an issue with only investment bankers and lawyers serving on boards. And it goes back to what I said before, if you think that this work is distinct work, that there are different dynamics in philanthropy in the nonprofit sector than there are in business, for example, then why would you have only business people on your board?
Phil, just one more question before we open it up to the audience conversation. Yeah. Our society today, in the United States and globally, I would argue, is very polarized. We can't seem to come together and have a respectful conversation as a country about our society, the best way for our society to move forward as a united democracy. What is the role of philanthropy in this era of divisiveness?
There's probably many roles that philanthropy can play. I think there are a number of major foundations that have tried to do things to, support the democratic institutions that I believe, really need to be supported to support good independent nonprofit journalism. For example, I think that's really, really important to support organizations, that are calling out some of the things that are going on that are most troubling, at least in my view, in this country, that are supporting organizations, raising questions about, is this really who we are as a society? And I'm trying to avoid getting too political, although it wouldn't be hard to nudge me to. But the other thing would be, I think oftentimes nonprofits are where folks are coming together. So and I just wonder, and they're supported by philanthropy, donors of different political stripes, different volunteers. So I think about, one of the things I try to do in the book is just tell the story of some of the just kind of regular and also extraordinary organizations that exist around us. And so you think about an organization like UTEC in Lowell, Massachusetts, which I read about, which is focused on, and I sort of alluded to them before, helping the most gang-involved young people get out of gang life. And workers there, the street workers, recruit these young people at hospital bedsides after a shooting, at funerals, in jail visits. Why? Because that's when these young people are open to a change. And then UTEC gets them employed in their mattress recycling facility, in their wood shop that makes cutting boards that gets sold to Whole Foods, their cafe in downtown Lowell, right across from the courthouse. They help them get GEDs. They now have a daycare. They work on policy issues, trying to get wins like expunging juvenile records. Supported by the former Democratic governor of Massachusetts, Deval Patrick, and held up as an exemplar. Supported by the current Republican governor of Massachusetts, Charlie Baker, held up as an exemplar, supported by Republicans and Democrats, funded by folks of all different ideologies. So I think there's hope there, and more broadly in some of the work on criminal justice and some of the unlikely alliances. Or you just look at a place like this tiny little community health organization I read about, Epiphany Community Health Outreach Services, connected to a church on which it resides. They help folks get eligible for benefits they didn't know they were eligible for. There's a line outside at Echoes, usually starting at 7 a.m. They open at 8. They sit with people and say, like, these are ways we can help you. They take folks to the food pantry. They're the place everybody in that neighborhood came after Harvey hit, and so did a bunch of volunteers. And I was in there one day and I talked to one of the volunteers, 79-year-old at the time, lawyer who spent almost every day there, and he told me that his wife thought it should be every day that he spends there, both because he wouldn't be in the house and because he was so happy when he got home. And he ran, among other things, the screening that they did, vision screening, free vision screening that they did, that, you know, and the relationships that this older white lawyer had with the clients who he would see more than once, or the staff that he would see every day. You know, I don't know what his politics are, but it's places like that people come together, right? And I said to him, and I tell a story in the book, but it maybe sounds silly, but I said to him after, he didn't really want to talk about this, like, what do you do here? I said, wow, you are really helping the people here. And he just looked right back at me and he said, they're helping me. And I think that's like that's where we bring people back together, you know, is through helping each other.
Well, on that note, let's open it up to the audience. Let's see. Can you please speak up loudly, introduce yourself, and hopefully we can hear the question and we can repeat it if necessary.
Hi, I'm Dana Dwan. I used to work in the nonprofit sector. I'm now a doctoral student. I read your book. I really appreciate that you kind of addressed the hard work of working in a nonprofit. Just to kind of switch it a little bit, the local nonprofits currently, a lot of them that I've worked with or know are nervous right now about receiving funds from large organizations, and a lot of them get attention very rapidly, you know, for doing some good work, and they'll get foundations, corporations looking at them. What would you say to them, like the best 3 questions to ask the funder, whether it's a foundation or corporation, to really suss out whether this one's going to try and dominate or control or micromanage the organization? You know, a lot of them are really new to the idea of receiving funds.
That's a really good question. I think, you know, it's funny, I had this conversation with a board member who actually, I write about in the book, also named Tiffany Guy, who ran Bell for years, which was working on summer learning loss. And it was a podcast, which was like so embarrassing because we got into this discussion about how do you make sure, you know, that you're not compromising. I was saying to her, like, that I thought, and I do think, that nonprofits can be more assertive with funders than they sometimes feel they can be. They can push back and say, we actually want general support, not just a program restricted grant. They can say, these are our goals and strategies, and this is how we measure results, this is how we assess how we're doing, rather than waiting for the funder to ask or tell. They can say, actually, you know, we need to offer benefits and pay decent wages to pay our people. Anyway, and then Tiffany, who's an African-American woman who became CEO of Bell at age 29, she said, I'm glad that you could do that. You know, I didn't ever feel that I could do that, which was the so embarrassing part. But I hear her, and I think that that I had all kinds of advantages that she didn't in her leadership role, although she also grew her organization massively. So somehow she was able to get it done. So that I guess my point of telling that story is I think it's dangerous for me to opine and to underestimate the power dynamics that exist along all kinds of different dimensions, including the funder and the funded, but also dynamics of race and gender and all kinds of other things, particularly if you have community leaders from a community and a funder that's from outside the community. So I don't want to underestimate any of that. And I do still think that being assertive and clear about what you're going for, as Tiffany was, and as I tried to be, and not being afraid to say no, to push back. And then, as a very practical matter, if you really are concerned about a funder, call other folks who are getting funding from them and ask them what it's been like. It's not too hard to find out, I think. See if they've done a grantee perception report with the Center for Effective Philanthropy. And if so, I'm serious, if it's on their website, because many foundations post on their website, read the results. That's another thing you can do.
Les?
Yeah, Les Lenkowski, and I have read the book, and not only read it, but written about it. I hope you like the review.
I did. Thank you for reviewing it, Les.
You can pay me later. But anyway, you've made a case, as you do in the book, for the importance of collaboration in philanthropy, with government, with communities, for finding common ground in an era of polarization, and so on. But isn't there also, and maybe even a stronger argument to be made for foundations, particularly those with substantial resources, to go it alone, to exercise independence, to sit astride the currents that are animating governments and communities, to actually maybe even be in opposition under certain circumstances. In fact, isn't the problem, which we began talking about, this critique of foundations as being undemocratic, the notion that in a democratic society, all institutions should be democratic? Maybe foundations are the institution, or at least one of the institutions, whose value is precisely that they are not democratic and not beholden to things like racial diversity on boards if they choose not to be.
You had me for part of that. I think, of course, I want to be clear. I think, obviously, boards are free. Foundation boards are free not to prioritize racial diversity, as evidenced by the fact that many of them clearly are not. My argument is that from an effectiveness perspective, if you look at the goals of foundations and strategies, often there's a disconnect between those goals and strategies and the experience and expertise of those on the board. And that I think that the board would be more effective if there was more alignment there. So that just to contextualize that. In terms of, when I say foundations, should collaborate and that they can't get a lot done alone, I do believe that, but I also believe that absolutely an important role is to be in opposition to government at times. And sometimes, and obviously the diversity of views and perspectives is going to mean that there are foundations, whose goals, if achieved, would seem to me, like steps backwards, and there are foundations whose goals, if achieved, I would be thrilled about, and that's part of the democracy too, is having these different institutions with different goals. And I think if you look at something like the efforts to influence and reform the criminal justice system, which happens to be a somewhat more, more ideologically diverse coalition of funders, but they are taking government to task, actually, and trying to change government policy. And I think that's really, really important. And I think that's at the core of some of my discomfort with some of the current critique, which seems to suggest that the government, is uniquely positioned to do everything really well. And my feeling is that we are treated to sort of daily reminders of the fact that that's not true. And so I think, and you and I, Les, may have different views of, what the government should or shouldn't be doing, or how effective different components of it are or aren't, whatever. That wasn't very well said, but you know what I'm saying. But I think we would probably both agree that donors and foundations should be free to try to have influence on those conversations. And I think that's fine. And I find it a little odd too that I can't get my head around this other contradiction, which is, for years all I've ever heard is foundations lamenting that they don't have more influence on policy. That's the only way real change happens. And then I think Rob is saying, and I don't mean to misconstrue what he's saying, but we have this whole debate at the Ford Foundation, and I think what he was saying is, no, they're too good at influencing policy. They don't think they're that good at it. They don't think they're driving the policy agenda in Washington, at least not the ones I'm thinking of. So it's confusing.
Yes.
Hi, Phil.
Hi.
Kathy is, I'm a first-year PhD student, but I've worked for 17 years at the Maine Health Access Foundation.
Oh, great.
So, and throughout my years, towards the end of my career, one thing I often thought about is sometimes foundations, I feel like they want to do too much, right?
Right.
And should we go back to just being the funders? Like, would we actually have been more effective instead of trying to design projects and programs and grant rounds? Would we have been more effective giving unrestricted support and trying to align ourselves with foundations that can help us achieve our mission, as opposed to project grants?
But with nonprofits that can help you achieve the mission.
Right.
Yeah, right.
We wouldn't get rid of our mission. We
Right.
would just align ourselves.
Yeah, right. I mean, I think everything is contextual, right? And what is the best way to achieve your goals? But I think often the best way to achieve your goals is if there are organizations whose goals align with your goals, then give them the long-term flexible funding they need to be effective. Totally agree. And we're not going to do one more survey because we've done 100 million at CEP. We're not actually, but a lot, to hear again that what nonprofits most need is long-term flexible funding. And yet, all the data that I've seen, CEP's data, which looks at one subset, but then also Candid/Foundation Center's data, which is somewhat more comprehensive, shows no real evidence of change in the provision of that kind of funding in the aggregate, despite some high-profile and welcome announcements from specific foundations like Ford or Citi or Chicago Community Trust and others. And so, irony of ironies, we have a project grant right now to explore what are the barriers to funders providing more multi-year generals. In all fairness, that funder also gives us very generous general operating support. So I'm very grateful to them. Hope they have not had me for teasing them if they see this on YouTube later. But it's a huge issue, and I think, asking the question, what is our role here? Are we trying to design a program? And if so, do we have the expertise to do that and knowledge? Are we trying to get behind something that's already been shown to work? If so, that's a different way of funding. It's a different approach to performance measurement. So these things, I think, are really dependent on what it is you're trying to do.
Nikki, I saw your hand.
So Phil, Mickey Levitan, I'm a visiting fellow at the School of Philanthropy. Phil, first of all, just publicly thank you for the book. It's chock full of insights, and I think any giver that reads it ought to be better at what they do for having read it, so thank you.
Thank you.
So this idea of the panel studies, studies that you're doing, the grantee perception reports and so forth, I read about them and I say, right on, great, this is a really good trend and like to see more of this and so forth. And then there's a part of me that says, duh, foundations need to learn that they should be talking to their grantees, right? Why is this such an, in your estimation and based on what you learned, why is this such an endemic issue that despite all the years you guys have been doing grantee perception reports, there's probably still a whole lot of foundations that aren't doing as much listening as they should? What are the key factors?
First of all, I don't want to be suggesting that the only way to effectively hear from your grantees is through CEP's grantee perception report, even if I do think it is the best way to get really candid feedback, which I do. But there are other things that other funders do, and smaller funders might say, well, I don't want to spend money on this or whatever, even though it's relatively inexpensive. But anyway, so I think, I do think that there's a couple things. I guess I know that funders think this is important. I think that there's a human tendency to say like, oh, well, now is not a good time, or we're in transition. And I mention that because the one group of foundations that actually we see real change, meaningful, like statistically meaningful change in the experience of their nonprofit grantees, but also in the funders' practices, including provision of multi-year general operating support, is the ones, and I don't mean to sound parochial, but it is true, it is what the data says, that regularly, on an every 2 or 3 year cycle, do this pretty significant process of the grantee perception report. And I think that's for the simple reason that, when my daughter asks me to stop doing something annoying once, I don't. I might think I will, but I don't. But then when she asks me again and again and again, I finally do. And the thing is, I can't get away from hearing what my daughters think, but funders don't regularly hear what their grantees think. And so unless you make the choice to regularly do it, to stick to it, to not say, well, during the CEO transition, maybe we should delay for 2 years, or whatever, you're not going to get that kind of feedback that, as humans, we need that repeated feedback before we realize, okay, we are really causing pain here. It is really annoying my kids that I'm doing it. I don't want to do that anymore, And I think it's the same kind of thing. So I think the intentions are mostly good, that's the best answer I can give. I'll say one other thing. That people say to me, oh, we did that grantee perception report. Getting that kind of customer feedback is so helpful. And this is another one of those, why can we not live outside of business analogies? They're not your customers. The money's flowing in the opposite direction. Why does that matter? Because it changes everything about the power dynamics. It changes everything about the power dynamics. And I tell a really silly story in the book, but it's true, about eating in a restaurant with my wife and daughters when there were mice everywhere, and it was a fancy restaurant, and even if it wasn't fancy, they shouldn't have had mice everywhere. And then they kind of blew it off like it was no big thing. We had a wedding earlier out on the patio, blah, blah, blah. And I trash them everywhere online, I'll tell everyone where not to eat, right? But I had a bad interaction with the program officer around the same time, and I didn't feel similarly empowered because actually it was one of the only programs that we were like a really good fit for a really big grant. Whereas I could eat at any number of restaurants. And I think that funders themselves over the years, even those who've worked at nonprofits before, need to figure out ways to remind themselves of how powerful that dynamic is.
We have a student with a question, Asrar.
Yeah, I'm doing my master at the Buchanan School. So during my last year, we mainly were focused on philanthropy and democracy from Western and American perspective.
Yeah.
Do you think especially in the United States, that these concepts, especially democracy, is different from in the United States.
Yeah, I mean, first of all, I think, yes, I think these issues are really important outside the United States, and Professor Harold is a particularly good person to talk about that, and we should all pre-order her book. And I would say, and I'm upfront about this in the book, I wrote about the United States because it's what I know. It's not because it's what I think is most important or should be emulated by everybody else. It just happens to be what I know, and I try to say, like, this is the context I'm writing about. I have a ton to learn. We're doing more and more work at CPP with foundations outside the United States, as well as the many, many foundations based in the United States that work outside the United States. But my learning curve is steep on that, and so I just try to confine myself, not in a United States is the center of the world kind of way, but just in a this happens to be what I know kind of way. But I believe that these questions that you're alluding to about democracy and the role of philanthropy, have a lot of resonance in a lot of other contexts and countries, and that's a really, really important conversation, and that we should have a book event about Katie's book to talk about it.
Well, with that, I'm going to actually take the liberty to jump in and say, Phil, the way in which you answered that question, which was to say, you know what, I only know the United States, so I'm not going to speak about how U.S. foundations should act abroad. Given my own experience in the rest of the world, I actually think it's very exemplary, right? Because what we often see outside of the U.S. are U.S. foundations or government aid agencies, and that's not just the U.S., but it's, you can speak for big foundations around the world. We have a doctoral student in the back who is studying the influence of philanthropy coming from abroad into the United States, and often coming in with certain agendas and certain assumptions of what will work elsewhere. And to my ear, anyway, your response was one that funders should really embrace in their own philanthropy abroad, which is, wait, we don't have the answers, so we need to do what you are calling for in your book, which is to get into those communities. So, sorry, that was a long interjection. Patrick.
Phil, thank you for coming the second time to visit us, and thanks for your humility and the good work for the last couple decades, especially. So we had a nice chat earlier today about DAFs and that. So I don't want. Feel free to comment on that, but I want to push on an issue that, without asking to bite the hand that feeds you. So we've done some work looking at payout rates of foundations, and I know lots of people have. But we've done hundreds of thousands of Monte Carlo experiments, and it's almost impossible to get foundations to go out of business, paying out 5, 6, 7, 8, even 9% under tremendous variance in economic performance. So, what do you think about raising the payout rate, or raising the payout rate to a countercyclical function so that when the economy is down and there's more hungry, more homeless, more people unemployed, needing training and so on, raising the payout rate during recessions at least. So again, not asking you to fire yourself, but...
Right. Yeah, I mean, I don't know. I don't know what I think about the policy change. The policy change that you're proposing. I know I agree with the spirit of what you're saying. That and I make this argument in the second to last chapter of the book, that foundations have a unique opportunity to be counter-cyclical forces. That when things are hardest for nonprofits, foundations can step up. And that there are examples of foundations doing just that in the wake of the Great Recession. Foundations like, if I remember correctly, MacArthur, RBF, Rockefeller Brothers Fund, up their payout, but they were exceptions. And obviously post-presidential election, 2016, there were some foundations such as Packard and others who felt that the issues they're working on had been affected in such a way that it was the right thing to step up their payout. And so I don't think people should default to 5%. I absolutely agree with that. I think that I don't know enough. I don't know that, I mean, I take you at your word about what is the right, percentage if they want to manage to keep the purchasing power of their endowment, relatively constant over time. I think every board should ask whether that should be the goal. Or whether, in fact, there is an argument to be made that they should spend themselves out of existence in some period of time. But again, I think that's like a goal and context-specific thing. So if you are wanting to support arts and culture in Indianapolis, you may well want to set yourself up in perpetuity to be there for the arts and culture organizations, 50 years down the road. I've gotten into hot water with some of my foundation friends for saying this, but I do kind of question the idea that you could have a program that was focused on climate change and argue that climate change is, as I believe it is, an existential and imminent threat, but then say, but we're managing our foundation to exist in perpetuity. On what planet? So I think those questions have to be addressed. I don't know whether Congress should address them or whether there is more work that we could do to get foundation boards to engage these questions and put them on the table. I mean, they should be on the table in the ways that you're suggesting.
Dean Pesek, I saw your hand. Before I come to you, may I ask the students first if they have it? The students are all reading Phil's book right now, so I just want to make sure if they have any questions that they would like to ask while we have the author here on stage. And then we'll come to Dean Pesek. Students? Aaron? Allie? Claire has a question.
Hi, my name's Claire. I'm in Dr. Merrill's class. She stares us all down, really wants to look at that. You touched on strategy and how business strategy is completely different from nonprofit strategy. You talked about how that should be collaborative. I'm just wondering for your opinion, how, when nonprofits come up with a strategy and foundation specifically, how can that be collaborative? Like how can we be transparent in that? If there are like practical ways, because a different foundation may come out with their strategic plan, have no idea that the foundation across the way,
Right.
maybe in the same geographical area, is really trying to do the same thing. How can they move alongside each other in that way?
Yeah, and that happens. What you're describing, as you probably know, because you're asking the question that way, it happens all the time, yeah. I think a good process involves looking at who else is funding toward the same or similar goals, and how can we connect up with them. Sometimes the answer will be not to fund the same strategy, but to say, well, we have similar goals, but actually you're working on this part, we'll take this part, or you think this is the best strategy, we're not so sure, we're going to try this one, let's share information and see which one works out better. This sound, like, I think the problem, right, is that I've seen this even on nonprofit boards I've been involved with, that it's easy to focus just very parochially on the one institution. And I think board members actually sometimes think that's their job, that it is their oath is to the institution. Ann Walliston, who is a terrific leader at BoardSource, I think is someone who's helped me really to think about what the conversations in the boardroom need to be, to recognize that there's a duty to the mission. And that involves a different kind of perspective.
Thanks. Dean Pesek?
Well, Phil, thank you for being with us. This has obviously been very stimulating for our community. So I'd like to ask you about some of the pathways for our students, actually. So we're in the business, hopefully, of helping effective young philanthropists, and some not so young, become even more effective in their careers. And you've interacted with a lot of both effective and ineffective folks. So what are some of the common characteristics, some of the preparation, some of the experiences that you think effective folks who are either on the giving or the receiving side share? And what are some of the things that you aspire to learn from them? And so that's the more general question. The other specific question has to do with working at foundations. So we always have some of our students who want to go work for foundations. Some of them have realistic notions of what that's about. Others just feel like it must be wonderful to be in the position of giving away money. And we're trying to help them get into those foundation experiences because, as you know, they're hard to often break into. So maybe you could comment about those two things, kind of what makes people effective in their roles as you've experienced it, and then if you might kind of lift the veil of foundations, what it's really like with the folks that you talk to in terms of a career choice.
Okay, thank you. And thanks for a great day with you and all your terrific colleagues here. It's been really fun. I don't know that I'm someone who should be doling out career advice, but since you asked me to, I think that one thing I was talking to one of your colleagues about earlier today is the importance, and maybe this is not directly about what folks need to do to be appealing to employers, but more about what they need to do to be, in my view, happy in their career. The importance of not just focusing on the issue that you care about and the area that you want to work on, which is important, but focusing on the culture and climate that you want to be in day to day. And I just have seen a lot of people take jobs they thought they couldn't possibly turn down because it was in just the area, and this is, everybody knows this organization or whatever. And then often everybody also knew, but maybe it was just sort of whispered, that this wasn't a great place to work. You know, that you look for places with really, this is going to sound platitudinous, but I really think it's so important with high integrity leadership that is open and transparent internally and externally, where you will have information about what's going on. Look for places where leaders actually are subjected to, it's a wrong way of putting it, but 360 feedback, where there is clarity of communication about what the organization is trying to do. Like, these things all sound so basic, but people can get caught up in the moment of, oh my gosh, I got an offer from such and such, and especially if it's like, oh, my mom's even heard of that organization. But don't act too quickly. Make sure you ask those questions. I believe that it's really important to be at least semi-facile in both numbers and words. You don't have to be a stats wonk, but to know enough about what questions it's possible to ask and answer, and to also focus on being a clear communicator verbally and in writing. I think I would not underestimate, just the value of. I've been surprised by how many young people I've worked with who don't feel they can ask for help from folks, or really just ask someone, to support them or mentor them, or that like to find those people who believe in you, who you can bounce things off of and cultivate a relationship with. So that's just some generic stuff. In terms of foundations in particular, my advice would be make sure you work at an operating nonprofit for a while first. My view is, there are people I know who've worked in foundations their entire career who I think are effective. I think it's harder to be effective if you haven't had the experience of being at an operating nonprofit. And the challenge of, what it's like when your organization has to worry about meeting payroll, or your organization is on the other end of some, messed up power dynamics with a funder. I think those are really important lessons. So I wouldn't try to get to a foundation right away. And then I wouldn't romanticize foundation jobs. I think foundation jobs can be good and they can be miserable, just like jobs anywhere. We have a product that is a staff survey of foundations. And I can tell you that there are staff who are miserable, and there are staff who are having a great time. And then that's true sort of on average, there's variation, and then within any particular foundation, of course, there could be a lot of varied experience. So I would say, I think it can be a good gig if it's the right place, but get that experience on the other side of the table first, and don't romanticize it too much.
Before we adjourn to the book signing table, Jamie? Phil, we have a token of appreciation. Now, Phil, you may have noticed that Phil has a great sense of style, and particularly sock style. So, knowing this in advance, what I was thinking is that I could find a pair of IU, Indiana University, dress socks, so that for your next few talks, you could wear those, and then every time you got a question about them, talk about the School of Philanthropy and send those to the students. But it turns out that the bookstore only has IUPUI Jaguar tube socks. So, maybe you can recruit some students for us at the gym. Thank you, Phil, so much for coming.
Thank you. One last thing. I just want to say, we didn't talk about this, but I met Katie Harold when she was a student at Mount Holyoke. I guess that was alluded to, but we didn't go into it. And Katie, it's been amazing to see all that you've accomplished, and it's an honor to share the stage with you, and I appreciate you and your colleagues, Dean Pasek, and everyone inviting me here. So thank you very much. I just want to express my gratitude.
Well, thank you, Phil. We're just so honored to have had you here, and